Hey, welcome back to That's Helpful with me, Ed Stott. Now, if you're anything like me, aging is probably something you just try not to think about until you wake up at 3 a.m. and you just can't get those scary thoughts out of your brain, or your birthday ticks over into another decade and you think, oh, holy crap, how did we get here? But it doesn't have to be this way. We can embrace aging, help to combat ageism, and make the most of all the brilliant things that come with it without denying, of course, the fact that it's not all wonderful. So how do we do it? Well, lucky for you, my guest today is an expert in this. Anne Karpf is a writer, sociologist, professor of life writing and culture at London Metropolitan University, and the author of How to Age. And thank you so much for joining me. I really appreciate it.
Oh, it's a great pleasure to be here.
I'm very excited to talk to you about this. So the book that you wrote is very interesting because you wrote it quite a while ago now. Was it 2008?
No, 2014.
2014. How have you seen attitudes to aging change in that time? Because I know at the time it was even tricky to get the book published, right?
Yeah, it was. I tried about 10 years before to get a book published on this subject, and a lot of editors became really excited about it. And then they went to their teams and they said, oh, nobody will buy a book like that. And the joke is this book has been translated into, I think, almost a dozen languages because, of course, everybody's interested because everybody's anxious. And yep. I would say since then, things have changed, but I think the anxiety has probably deepened and widened. I wrote this book in particular for younger people, in particular younger women, but for men as well, because what I was noticing was that the anxiety about age was setting in really young. There were message boards of people about to turn 30 that were just full of dread and anxiety. And in fact, I thought back to when I was turning 30, which is quite a long time ago. And I remember feeling the same way. And it's interesting because there was a brilliant American woman called Maggie Kuhn who set up something called the Grey Panther movement, which was old and young people, intergenerational together. And she said, oh, yes, my 30th birthday was my worst one. And she said that when she was 85. And that tells you something. So I wanted to look at why people are so anxious before their 30th birthday or in their 30s and early 40s, when we are living longer, particularly those of us who aren't in the global south, who aren't very poor. We're living longer than ever, healthier lives than ever. And we're more anxious about aging than ever. So we start getting anxious earlier. We live longer. That tells you we're going to be anxious for a very long time. And I wanted to think about, does it have to be this way? Are there alternatives? And the first alternative that you are presented with are those who deny age, who say, oh, age is just a number. We are generation ageless. And that felt to me like not a very helpful way of looking at it, because age isn't just a number. It is a real thing. And we're not generation ageless because we are going to age. And it seemed to me that the route of denying it wasn't a helpful one. So I wanted to see if I could find a kind of third way. And that's why I wrote the book.
Yeah, Maggie Kuhn, I absolutely adore. I discovered her through your work, but she is my hero. Her battle cry was learning and sex until rigor mortis. I think that is a motto we can all absolutely live by. So you touched on it a little bit there, but what's been your own experience and relationship to aging?
Oh, well, that is a very good question. Obviously, I was 10 years younger when I wrote the book. I and I hadn't. It's interesting. When I first wanted to write this book, I think you write the books you need to read.
Oh, yeah.
And I think I was beginning to think about my own aging. I've had amazing role models in my life. My parents were quite old when they had me, and they lived. They were very lucky to live to a venerable old age, and they were very, very active. My mother was a Holocaust survivor, a survivor of Prushoff, the camp that was in Schindler's List, and Auschwitz. And she gave her last concert at the age of 94. And my father was a survivor of Russian labor camps, and he retired at the age of 90. And my husband's quite a bit older than me, and even though he had a horrible diagnosis last year, he's still working. So I've had very active role models. So on the one hand, I suppose I've grown up with the idea that that you continue to work and do things no matter what your age. On the other hand, I live in a very ageist culture, and I can't help but be affected by that. And people have often said to me, "Oh, you don't look your age," and that always worries me, because at some stage I will, and I don't want to be trading off that. Maggie Kuhn, the wonderful Maggie Kuhn, said, "We'll know that things have changed when you look your age is a compliment, and not a pejorative statement." So I live in this culture that tells me that I shouldn't look my age. And I mean, for example, with my students, I don't make a whole big thing of it, but I sometimes say something about, yes, well, as an old person. And sometimes they say, "Oh, but you're not old." And I say, "Yes, I am old, and it's fine." So I want to challenge that taboo against saying you're old, because there are so many terrible associations with old that people disavow it and disidentify with it. And I'm trying to say, look, one can say one's old, and that doesn't mean, the opposite, that old doesn't mean set in your ways. Old can be about learning new things, lifelong learning. Old can be sexy, exciting, but it doesn't have to be those things, because the other thing that I am trying to challenge, and I see it in my own life, is the idea that there's one single way to age, because all the evidence is that we become more different from each other and more diverse when we age, and not the same, because there's this idea that you hit some milestone birthday, whether it's your 30th, or your 40th, 50th, 60th, people keep pushing it back. And suddenly you step onto this spaceship that takes you onto this planet called old. And you leave behind everything that made you, you love jazz or reggae or clubbing or sleeping or joking or reading. You leave everything behind. You are evacuated of every feature that makes you you, and you become nothing but old. And that's such a terrible idea. Why would anyone want to say they're old if that's what it means? Becoming un-me. And in fact, what we hear and I've interviewed so many people about aging, and almost invariably they say, "I don't feel old." And you think, what does that mean? What does that mean? And it's because they've got this stereotype of what old is, and they don't feel like, they feel just like themselves, but just at another age. Do you feel young when you're young? No, you feel like yourself. There's a birthday card I give friends, and friends like me who are old, and it says, "It's weird being the same age as old people." It's because old is always someone else. It's what we attribute to someone else. And with us, it's just, I'm myself, but I've got more experience, and there are positives and negatives. And that's the thing, that we have to challenge the idea that what I call the deficit model of aging, that it's all about loss when we get older. Of course, there are things you lose. You know, I know now with absolute certainty that I will never win the women's singles final at Wimbledon. I know that at my age, but I could have told you that 50 years ago as well. But there are things that I have gained that, you know, I've become much less fearful of certain things in life, of other people's opinion. And almost everybody says that about aging. You don't care what other people think so much. You focus more on the essentials because you know that life isn't infinite. I mean, there are so many benefits that if you're lucky enough not to be poor and hungry, to have a disability in a culture that is very ableist, or to be white, as I am, in a society where there's a lot of racism. So all these things impact upon how we age. But the idea that it was all downhill from now on, I hate, and there's a phrase that it's attributed to the actress Betty Davis, and it's "old age isn't for sissies." And I hate that phrase because, first of all, I think it's a bit homophobic and, you know, heteronormative. But also, I mean, life isn't for sissies because life has challenges at every single stage. And what we do is we project all the negative onto old age, all the fragility, all the vulnerability, all the dependence. So we don't have to own that at the preceding stages. But I can tell you that as a young woman, I had lots of miserable, terrible times, and I have as an old woman. And I've had joy at both ages. So I think what I'm trying to say is that we have focused in some ways too much on age as a single defining quality that shapes your life. And it's only one of many others.
Yeah. And you talk about the fact that, you know, as we age, all of our former ages aren't just erased by age, but they kind of become incorporated into ourselves like rings in a tree, right?
Yeah, I think that's really important to remember because that makes it less scary. That means that, you know, we don't have to give up our former selves. I mean, some people, like I've interviewed quite a lot of women who, and some say, oh, it's terrible the way as you age, you become invisible in cultures like Australia, the US, the UK. And then there are other women who say, oh, it's fabulous. I no longer have to, you know, dress and make up for how other people want me to look, how the culture has expected me to look. I mean, when this book came out, I did an event with an American writer and a broadcast, and it was all about looking kind of foxy at 50 or, you know, hot at 100. And I went, oh, God help us. If I'm lucky enough to live to 100 and I'm still having to care about looking hot. On the other hand, I love makeup, I love clothes, and I do those things for myself. You know, I like to look good for myself. And I like to feel physical. I mean, I am much fitter now than I was for most of my life because I have to. Because, you know, there's that whole thing about use it or lose it. Although, as I say in my book, you can use it and also lose it. But, you know, so I just feel like, that I love what the American poet May Sarton said when someone asked her why she so enjoyed being 70. And she said, I am become more fully myself. And I think that is what one is aiming for, not to not look your age, but to become more fully yourself, to develop your abilities, to develop your relationships, your capacity to love and to laugh and to grieve, because there are losses always in life, and to become, more fully yourself. So this is me. This is how I am, to feel less shame, less embarrassment. That is what I am aiming for in aging.
And what a wonderful thing to aim for. I really love that. And so obviously that's one of the benefits of aging. Like you say, we care less about, well, for you care less about what other people think. And that is a common experience, but not for everyone. But what are some of the other benefits that you've come across that are kind of common within aging when you've interviewed all these people, as you said, and in your research for studying aging?
Well, I think one is interesting to do with the brain, because people go on about senior moments, which again, it's so interesting, the ageism in our language. As many people have observed, if you're young and you fall, people say, "Oh, I fell over." If you're old, people say, "I had a fall," as if it happened to you. You have no agency anymore. Things just happen. And people say, "Oh, senior moments." And it's to do with the assumption that one's memory goes. And of course, there's a lot of anxiety around dementia and Alzheimer's, a subject I'm very interested in, because I do know a number of people who have experienced and are going through the early stages of dementia. But what the evidence seems to show is that while our short-term memory and our verbatim memory declines, a different kind of memory is developed, and that is the memory, the gist memory, to make connections between different things. So our ability to link something now with something in the past, or something in one place with another place, or to skim a document and get a sense of it develops. So I think that is something that happens, particularly if you are a person who is prepared to take risks and try new things. I think that is really important. And what all the research shows is that a lot of the negative messages we hear about age become self-fulfilling prophecies. So there's a very interesting researcher at Yale called Ellen Langer, and she's done research where she has exposed people to positive images about aging and negative images, and sort of seen how they walk and how they do physical things beforehand and afterwards. And what she's found is that the people exposed to negative images about aging and ageism do less well and are more wobbly than the ones who've been exposed to positive images. So, it's clear that we internalize those images, and that we and that they affect how we do things. But I think the other thing that I've noticed is, and that I think is really interesting, and particularly for people like me who are very kind of doey kind of people, and I've got this deadline and that deadline and this lecture to give, and that in cultures that are more being oriented, it is easier to age. There's more respect for old people. And in cultures that are more doing based, where your status comes more from your work and your achievements, it's harder to age. And I remember I was one of, I've done lots of events around aging, and when the book came out, I was doing one. And, it was full of older people, and they were all saying, "Oh, yes, and I still do this, and I still that." And by the way, I hate it when people say, "Oh, she's still beautiful, he's still attractive." I think, get rid of that still. But, everyone was talking about things they do. And one woman put up her hand and she said, "Gosh, this is exhausting me hearing you all." And I tell you what I did yesterday. She said, "I sat for an hour in my garden and watched a goldfinch, and the whole room went, with longing and delight. And I thought, what a gorgeous thing to do. And she said, when I was younger, I was too busy to notice things like that. So I think it's also about what you notice and what is important to you. And to me, I mean, I am a person who I don't think, I'm still struggling to get balance in my life between sitting, looking at the goldfinch and giving the lecture and writing the article and the book. I mean, those dewy things excite me and energize me, but so does, looking at the goldfinch. And I'm still struggling at my old age to get a balance between that. And I hope that I will manage it before I die, but who knows?
One of the other things that you talk about, obviously, which is kind of the elephant in the room when we talk about aging, is our fear of death. How can embracing death reduce our fear of aging?
Well, honestly, I think this is really a key question. I mean, death it remains one of the great taboos, certainly in the UK. I mean, it's interesting. My younger daughter, partly in response to her father's health and the fact that my husband has had a not very great diagnosis last year, though he's managing really very vigorously in spite of it. But she's always been quite anxious about death. And she has started going to death cafes. I don't know if you have them in Australia.
I've heard about them.
Well, there are places where people of all ages go and meet informally and talk about death. And the aim is to destigmatize death and to get people comfortable talking about it. Now, I grew up with stories because my parents were Holocaust survivors. All the deaths that I heard about were very abnormal deaths. There were people being murdered and killed and not dying a natural death, which, I mean, my father was the first person really that I knew who did die a natural death. I mean, I think this is really essential, and it links in with the idea of what I call in my book the arc of life. So the idea that, from the moment we're born, we start to age. So aging isn't something that just happens at the end of life. We are aging throughout our life, and different things happen at different stages of life. And we need to see our life as in the totality. And we're not ever encouraged to do that because aging is so frightening that we, as you said at the beginning, we really try not to think about it. And it's interesting, I've known people who have lost a child, which I think is the most terrible thing to have to deal with in life. Absolutely. The loss of a child, it feels so abnormal. And when I've thought about it, I've thought, well, the only way really of surviving it is to think of that child's life as entire in itself. That is their lifespan, and that is the whole of their life, instead of thinking about what they didn't live to do, which of course is a completely natural thing and a natural response of a parent that loses a child. But eventually to come to think of that child's life as entire in what it was, because we each have the arc of our life, and there are losses and gains at every stage of that life, and the end of life is death. And a lot of people much wiser than me have said that, I mean, I'm not talking about a morbid obsession with life, with death. Well, a morbid obsession with life probably goes with a morbid obsession with death. But I'm talking about the ability to remember that we're going to die. And if one can integrate that into one's life, I think it not only reduces the fear, but also enables one to focus more on what's important.
Absolutely. And if we only take one thing from our conversation today about aging and coming to terms with it and, really making it a part of our life rather than closing our eyes and burying our head in the sand, what's the one thing you want people to take away?
Well, I would want to take away from them the fear and the stereotypes. I think if one can dispense with the you see them on street signs in the UK. You see that the symbol for old people is a couple bent over with a walking stick. Now, there's nothing wrong with walking sticks or Zimmer frames or hearing aids. Use everything you can to keep you in the world, but those stereotypes that people feel, I am going to become this, and it's too terrifying. So what I would like to say to people, you are going to remain yourself, just an older version of yourself. You will have got rid of, hopefully, of some of the things, some of the baggage. The French actress Nathalie Baye said, you need to step more lightly upon the world as you get older. So you need to cast off some of your baggage that weighs you down. So some of the negative things that we've all been told when we grow up, oh, you're so this, or you're that, or other people's view of ourselves. Just, we need to learn to cast those things off, to find other people like ourselves who haven't internalized those stereotypes, but also to go out into the world with an open mind and curiosity so that we can see different ways of living and maybe find ways that suit us better. I mean, I love the stories of people who develop same-sex relationships as they age. They call it out late. And suddenly, I've met so many women who've fallen in love with other women and been completely surprised, at 50 or 60, or men who've come out. And then there are also, what was it that David Bowie used to say? He said that he was a closet heterosexual and he only discovered his heterosexuality late. So, and one can discover things about one's own sexuality, one's own sexual needs and desires. Don't let anyone tell you that those necessarily abate with age. For some people, I interviewed one woman and said, oh, such a relief not to be enthralled to sexual desire anymore. I've interviewed many other people who say, oh, what were they talking about? I feel sexier than I ever did. So there is no one way about aging. We have to aspire to be like May Sarton and to become more fully ourselves. And that's what I wish everyone.
Yeah, I love that. Wow, how empowering. Such a great joy to chat. Thank you so much, Anna. Really appreciate you sparing me the time.
It's a real pleasure to talk to you. And I think you're going to be a model of aging for the people around you.
Oh, I do hope so. You've inspired me, though. I've got some tools now. I feel way more equipped when I wake up at 3 a.m. and this is not going to be keeping me awake anymore. I feel much better about it. And I know everyone else will too. My guest today is Anne Karpf. She's a writer, sociologist, professor of life writing and culture at London Metropolitan University, and the author of How to Age. I'm going to put the link to Anne's book in the show notes so that you can check that out, because it really is very helpful if this is something like me that's giving you a little bit of anxiety and keeping you up at night. Let's address it. There are some really brilliant things that we can do to change the way that we think about aging without denying it, and the book is full of those tools. So definitely check that out, and check out links to Anne and where you can find more of her work in the show notes as well. Thank you so much for joining me. I really appreciate it. If you're enjoying the show, please leave me a review wherever you're listening. I will be very, very grateful, and it helps other people find our little self-help club too. I'm Ed Stott, and I sincerely hope that's helpful.